Yo, what's up, everybody? It is Thursday, May 15th. How's everybody doing? Well, we had a mixed day today. Dow was up, NASDAQ was down, S&P was up a little bit. S&P right at the level again where not yesterday, the day before, we saw some liquidation, short covering. Actually, there was some yesterday too, a very small amount. Today's price action looked to me like some new money was entering into the market. I am still waiting to see the evolution of the fiscal data, to see what is happening with those leading spending flows like I talked about yesterday. I'm also thinking about the fact that these deals that Trump is making in the Middle East, he's announcing, right now, I don't know, it's like in the trillions of investment commitments from Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This is a very interesting development because it may change fundamentally, or let's put it this way, I may have to change fundamentally the core of what I look at, the framework of my analysis, which is the fiscal flows of the United States government, of the federal government, because what Trump is doing here, if he actually succeeds in getting this level of investment flowing, is he has triggered or he has fostered net foreign spending. Okay, so like up until now, the reason why my analytical framework was so efficient in forecasting was, as I always say, that's the core driver of all economic activity, because the federal government of the United States was the net spender basically for the whole entire world. Okay, these deficits that flowed out as net government transfers to everybody, to China, to Europe, to everybody, to Japan, okay, to the United States. If Trump has succeeded in talking these countries into being net spenders into the U.S. economy, then that's a different kind of flow. And I got to see where to get data on that. I mean, that's not going to be available like the stuff we get here in the United States, which is, there's nothing comparable anywhere, even like in the Euro area or Japan or China. There's nothing comparable anywhere to the reporting, the statistical data reporting that we see here in the United States, where literally the Treasury puts out its statement every single day. So I gotta think about this. I don't know. They may say, yeah, we're gonna do this, and these countries I mentioned, but we'll have to see. For now, the framework remains unchanged. It's fiscal flows of the United States. Folks, from time to time, it's important to, I think, repeat ideas or concepts, because that's how people learn. That's how we learn, is through repetition. And my channel has grown, not quite 10,000 subscribers, getting close, 9,500, but I'm sure there's a lot of new people on here. And again, I'm starting to see comments that like, the only thing that creates inflation is money printing. So I have to address this again, because I've addressed it many times in the past, but like I said, maybe some people are new here and they haven't heard my comments on this. First of all, if you are a capitalist, and I assume pretty much everybody is, if you are a capitalist, that claim makes no sense whatsoever. Because the principal tenet of capitalism is the profit motive, okay? And commerce or transaction is money-based. In other words, we use money as the accounting instrument to record transaction. All right, we don't do like barter anymore. It's a money-based economy. To the extent that money is created, that induces the capitalists, the private sector, to meet that demand with an increase in supply of goods and services. In other words, the money printing induces, we'll call it money printing, but let's call it, we'll call it spending by the government, induces the private sector to create the goods and services to meet that demand. So you might have an increase in the money supply, but at the same time, you have an increase in the output of goods and services. So there shouldn't be any inflation as long as the economy is functioning normally. And by that, I mean there are no impediments to production. There's available resources, there's available labor. If you don't have those conditions, if you don't have available resources, if you don't have available labor, then yes, I would say that money printing in that condition, in that situation, would create higher prices. And that's exactly what we saw during the pandemic when the global supply chain was shut down. But there was a record amount of fiscal stimulus at the time. People got checks and all kinds of financial support from the government, but the global supply chain was shut down, so the productive economy couldn't meet that demand. Now, I just want to give you some data here to, I hope, clarify for those of you who still think that money printing causes inflation. The broadest definition of money, if we're talking about, let's talk about the United States, would be the so-called national debt. The national debt is all the money that the United States has created since its inception, which it has not taken away in the form of taxation. In other words, that's the outstanding balance of money created since the beginning of the Republic. I'm going to use 1980. When Reagan came in, we had a public debt, national debt of $800 billion. Since then, up until now, and at that time in 1980, we had an inflation rate of like 21% or something like that. 18%, something like that. Since then, that money supply has grown to 36 trillion. Okay, because that's the national debt right now. That is the outstanding balance of US dollars held by the non-government globally in the form of treasuries, but that's just, that's just a dollar, exchangeable. So 36 trillion, and the inflation rate as of the last reading on the CPI is 2.8%. So what kind of an increase is that? That's 800 billion to 36 trillion. What is that, like a 4,000% or a 400 times, would be 40 times, 400 times something increase in the money supply globally, the supply of dollars, and the inflation went from like 20% to 2.8%. So there is absolutely no correlation between the quantity of money and the inflation rate, so long as those other conditions that I mentioned don't exist. In other words, you have a functioning global economy that has sufficient resources and sufficient labor. All right? And there's no other way to look at it. Now, if you say, well, Mike, in 1971, a new car was $3,500, and now a new car is $40,000, that's not a correct way to quantify inflation, okay? Because nominal price means nothing. What we do is we sell our labor, we sell our work, we sell our time for money. And it is the amount of labor hours that are required to purchase a basket of goods and services. Okay, so the way you really figure out inflation, or the way you quantify inflation, how much time did it take in terms of labor hours in 1971? I'll use 1971 because that's when Nixon took us off the international gold standard. And that's when a lot of these monetarists and gold bug people and all these inflationistas, they always go back to that. Like, we should have stayed on that. You know, they're still talking about I could go to a movie theater for 25 cents and see 2 movies. You know, you can't. I mean, that's ludicrous. That's silly. So in 1971, how many labor hours were required to buy that new car compared to how many labor hours are required right now to buy that new car? Well, it actually turns out that right now, it does require more labor hours, but not that much. I've done these studies over the years, and it was really during the pandemic when it finally broke out ahead that it requires more labor hours now to purchase the new car than it did back in 1971. But from 1971 all the way until 2020, still pretty good. It took less labor hours to purchase a brand new car than it did back in 1971. That is how you quantify inflation. Now, there's another thing that we never really talk about. I don't know necessarily if I need to mention it, but I will, is the fact that cars and most goods have gotten a lot better. If you're as old as I am, you could remember a time when you weren't sure if your car was going to start up on the first turn of the key, even if it was a new car. And if it was really cold, if it was the dead of winter, you could pretty much be sure that it wasn't going to start up. I mean, we don't have these problems anymore. Not to mention the fact that the cars nowadays come with, power steering, power brakes, air conditioning, power windows, anti-lock braking systems, airbags, like all these comforts and convenience, GPS built in. Like, the amount of technology and innovation and the improvement, that itself adds so much value to the product. Now, the reason why I said I'm not even sure if I'm going to mention it is because we always, technology advances things all the time. All right. So like, that's just a given. That's just a given. Like what you're buying now for that little bit more of a labor cost than what we're talking about back in 1971. I mean, it just comes with so much more. So you're getting so much more for your labor hours now than you did back then. So like, and inflation, the other definition of inflation is a continual rise in prices. And again, I'm not talking about on a nominal basis. You can't look at nominal prices. You have to look at it the way I explained it, because how do we get our money? If you're talking about money, you got to talk about, well, how do we get it? We get it by selling our labor. So how much of my labor do I need to sell to get a certain quantity of money to buy a certain good or service? You got to quantify it like that, because that is the exchange. That's how we get the money. So like, you can't, when you say things like inflation is caused by printing money, that's just such an unsophisticated, it's just not true. It's one of these things, it's like a buzz phrase that everybody heard so often, and they just feel comfortable repeating it without any thought going into it whatsoever. And on the surface to them, it sounds right. It's one of those things that sounds right on the surface. Like, gee, a car was $3,500. and now it's $40,000. And what changed? We have all this money printing, so it must be true. You know, it's kind of like, well, gee, I wake up in the morning, you know, and the sun is in the east, and at night the sun is in the west, so the sun must be circling the earth. No, that's not how it is. It's the other way around. We're circling, you know, the earth is spinning. So it gives that perspective of the sun moving across the sky. That's not how it is. So, like, I understand why people think this, because they hear it all the time and it sounds plausible to them. But that's not how it is. That's just not how it is. And if you call yourself a capitalist, you cannot go around saying that money printing causes inflation, because that destroys the whole concept of capitalism, which is the profit motive. And in a money economy, the profit of an enterprise is represented by money. We live in a money economy, right? So the profit is represented by money. So when the government creates money, or when the government spends, and that's the creation of money, again, I'll say it, it induces the private sector to create. Look, if you own defense stocks, or if you own healthcare stocks, and if you own them, let's go back. I mean, if you own those stocks since 1980, when this whole big boom of money printing, or even if you own them since the pandemic, you made a lot of money, because those companies made a lot of money, made a lot of profit. That's the profit motive. That is capitalism. And they created more things, more goods and services. I don't know, like defense, they created more planes and munitions and ships and all these other things. So that should be your proof right there. And even if there was some inflation, if you own those capitalist firms, that took care of you. Like I always said, when we were having this whole inflation thing going on, I made a ton of videos where I said, look, it's up to you to take care of yourself. We have this beautiful vehicle available to us called the stock market. If you don't want to use that, that's on you. And if you're complaining about companies raising their prices, businesses raising their prices, and you have an opportunity to participate in that, yet you do not, you rather sit on the sidelines and whine and complain and cry about prices, that's on you. I mean, I make these videos to try to help you. If you don't want to do that, then I really think you don't have the right to complain about it. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has the possibility of doing a total offset of those price increases. Maybe, you know, you don't have the available cash to invest, or maybe a small amount, but even small is better than nothing. You know, I'm a big believer, like, help yourself. Do what you can to help yourself. Don't sit there like a victim and just wallow in this, oh, poor me, look at what's going on. I mean, we live in this fantastic country with all this opportunity right out there. I make these videos. I try to help you guys. I got this little, silly report that hardly costs anything. I try to help you guys, and it's like, oh, money printing causes inflation. Money printing causes inflation. Because why? Because you heard Peter Schiff say it, and it sounds right, and so you're just going to repeat it? So yeah, I feel like if anything needs repeating, it's the message that I just brought to you guys right now. Anyway, that's it for today. Please like and subscribe. I'm trying to get to 10,000 subscribers on it. It's still a long way to go, over 500 or 500. And don't forget, Go to my website, pitbulleconomics.com, and sign up for a 30-day free trial to MMT Trader. See you tomorrow. Bye.